Hello, I'm Cathy. Welcome to Lunarbird Book Club. So I am so excited today because today we are starting my series on the classics. Classics with Cathy, if you will. This has been in my mind to do for quite a few months now. The idea behind this series has come from a few places. I just finished a degree in English literature last year. I studied classical civilizations years ago at sixth form, and in the past couple of years, gosh, I think it's about 3 or 4 years, I've also been working my way through this beast of a challenge. Just completely covered my face. Okay, this is a poster with a top 100 books on it, and it's like top 100 great works of literature to read, and I've been working my way through them and ticking them off, and I'm nearing the end of that challenge now. And basically, I love reading classic works, discovering new authors, discovering what books and stories have inspired and enthralled people in different places and ages. So I'm really passionate about this subject, but I'm also really passionate that classics don't need to be a scary thing reserved for the people who think they're brainy. That actually lots of classic works became classic because they spoke to a wide range of people and they can be accessible. My idea behind this series is to create my own list of 100 classics. 100 seems really ambitious now because I've had the idea to this series for like months and we're only just starting on book 1. But maybe once I get going, this will flow quicker than I imagine. But I've basically made my own list of 100 classic works that I think are wonderful, readable, and worth delving into. And for each one, I just want to do a short video helping to introduce it, hopefully to new readers, and help people to meet the book on its own terms and maybe decide for themselves whether this is a book that they would enjoy or not. Because you don't want to waste your time reading books that aren't for you. But some works of classic literature look really intimidating and are actually just really fun and readable and exciting. And it'd be a shame to miss out on those. And I decided to go through this list of 100 classic works in chronological order, which means today we are going all the way back to 700 BC because the earliest written book on my list is Homer's The Odyssey. So let's start with a few simple facts about the Odyssey. It was composed roughly around 700 BC. It's accredited to the Greek poet Homer, and it was written as epic poetry. So it was written in verse form, probably composed not for written storytelling but for oral storytelling. And that's why it was written in poetry, because poetry is easier to remember and repeat and pass on from one person to the next. And it's an epic adventure story. It involves gods and monsters and massive journeys and wars and battle. It's an adventure on a huge scale, and it's been a huge influence on lots of other stories and adventures and films and music and poems and art ever since. It's one of the foundational texts in studying classics, and it's just a brilliant, fun adventure. So let me tell you a little bit about the plot. I don't want to give away any major spoilers, but just a summary of what this book is about. There's basically 2 storylines going on. The first one is one which you're perhaps more familiar with. There's Odysseus. He's a Greek soldier. He has fought in the massive Trojan War and he needs to get home. Unfortunately for Odysseus, he has angered 1 or 2 of the key gods, including the god Poseidon, who's in charge of the sea. And they have set themselves up against Odysseus and they are determined to thwart him on his return journey. So he is met with a lot of disasters and monsters and things out to get him. So his journey home takes 10 years. And Odysseus is a fantastic character. He is strong, he is brave, he is proud, but what he's most known for is his cunning. So he is always thinking of tricks and devices and clever ways to navigate the perils that he is faced with. The second part of the story concerns Odysseus' family, who he left behind. So you have Penelope, his wife, and Telemachus, his son, who is now 20 and who's been waiting for his father for 20 years. Penelope is beset by a crowd of suitors, rich noblemen on the island, who have come to try and get her to marry them so that they can take over Odysseus's lands and wealth and marry the beautiful Penelope. These suitors are eating up all the food and the drink. They're always on the edge of violence. If Penelope outright refuses them, they might just go and kill Telemachus and Penelope. If she accepts them, she's betraying her husband, who she is still waiting in hope that he will return. So Penelope is in a tough spot. Telemachus is in a tough spot because obviously all the suitors want him out of the way too. And as he turns 20, Athena, the goddess of war, starts meddling and starts spurring Telemachus on to put things in action to deal with these suitors. And what makes these two plots so engaging is the way that they're structured. So the Odyssey has a fascinating structure, so if you're reading it, look out for this. We're used to books beginning at the beginning, but the Odyssey doesn't begin at the beginning, it begins really near the end, or in the middle of things. There's a Latin term for that, in medias res, which means when a book or a story starts you off in the middle of stuff going on. And that's exactly how the Odyssey starts. The Odyssey doesn't start with Odysseus leaving for war or trying to begin his journey home again. The Odyssey begins with Odysseus already being gone for 20 years and Athena going to the rest of the gods, particularly to Zeus, to beg him to interfere to save Telemachus from the suitors' plots. So we're suddenly thrust into intrigue and adventure and tension right from the beginning. And then as the story progresses, you have some chapters following Telemachus and we have some chapters following Odysseus, and then we kind of come back to Telemachus towards the end, and then Telemachus' storyline and Odysseus' storyline meet together. And these two storylines together mean that there's this fantastic tension that grows throughout the Odyssey, because you know, even if Odysseus gets home, it's not going to be plain sailing. And whilst Penelope and Telemachus are trying to keep things at peace, the suitors are also ramping up plots against Telemachus. So there's this huge tension brewing of what's going to happen when Odysseus gets home, which leads, like, the final section of the book is just fantastic, but I don't want to tell you too much about it. So because of this structure, the Odyssey reads as a really fast-paced adventure. Things move on very quickly and we start in the middle of action, and it keeps building and building and building towards the grand finale. And I guess whilst we're on there, we should talk about translations. There are lots of different translations of the Odyssey. Some translations try to keep the poetic form, and others tell it more as a prose narrative. I'll admit I've only ever read it as a prose narrative, but I do really want to read Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey because she has kept it in a poetic form, and I've read little bits and articles of things that she's written about the decision she's made in doing that. So I would really love to read her translation of it, but I haven't yet. Rachel has a copy and I believe she's reading it now, and when she's done I'm going to ask to borrow it. But the version that I've been reading, and the one I've read most recently, is a prose narrative one. It's translated by Vllo. So what translation you choose to read might affect how much you enjoy it or what you get out of it. If you read it in poetry, you're reading it closer to its original form. If you're reading it in prose, it's a bit closer to contemporary writings, but you might find it easier to read. But the choice between prose or poetry is up to you. I don't think there's a wrong way to read the Odyssey, and it doesn't have to be one or the other. It could just be first and second. I've only read the prose translations. I'm really looking forward to reading the poetry one too. So, you know, books, good stories are worth a reread, and you can read them in different translations. That's all part of the fun. The other thing that you might want to know before you start reading the Odyssey is that the Odyssey is one tale that is part of a much broader spectrum of Greek mythology. And Greek mythology was written and composed and came together in lots of different forms by lots of different authors and creators and traditions. And that's quite exciting, because the moment you start reading a little bit of Greek mythology, there's always more to discover. So even when you read the Odyssey, you'll see it seems to be connected to a greater tapestry of events and stories. So even like we know the Odyssey is set just after the Trojan War. So the Trojan War is a huge part of ancient Greek mythology. You probably already know a little bit about that, but basically Helen of Sparta is seduced away from her husband Menelaus by Paris, Prince of Troy. So Paris and Helen sneak off to Troy, and then Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon, who are both kings, gather together a huge army of Greeks and kings and kingdoms, and they all unite and they go to Troy to win back Helen, and then that war takes 10 years. And it ends famously with Odysseus, our main man Odysseus, coming up with a scheme where they build a huge giant horse out of wood, hide some soldiers in the horse, leave it out for the Trojans, and then the Greek army pretends to sail away. And then the Trojans come out, believe the horse is an offering to the gods, they take it inside their city, and then at night, when everyone's asleep, the soldiers sneak out of the horse, open the city gates, the rest of the army comes in, and Troy is destroyed. That's like the briefest version of the Trojan War. There's lots of things that happen in there. But you see, like, the Odyssey obviously relates a lot to those events. There's also little snippets of other stories involving the gods, how they fall out with one another, how they fall in love with one another. There's mention of the fabled Hercules. So the Odyssey is just one story, one thread in a much wider tapestry. And again, you can kind of see how that must have rooted back to these tales coming up primarily as oral tellings, because people would share a story and then add something to it and then relate something to it. And as stories moved from town to town, village to village, person to person, people would put their own interpretations on. They'd expand on one myth, they'd connect one myth to another myth, they'd weave these stories together until we have this huge big tapestry of Greek mythology that we kind of all know now. But there wasn't just one author behind that, there were many voices that accumulated over time and place. And I think that's a fascinating thing of collective storytelling. And the Odyssey is just such a fantastic gateway into Greek mythology, and that's why I've put it as the first book on my 100 classics list. So if you do decide to pick up the Odyssey, I just thought I'd mention 3 cool things to look out for. The first thing is to notice how important hospitality is to the culture of the Odyssey. So by hospitality, I mean what happens when a stranger or a guest turns up at your door. So there's this huge thing in the Odyssey of treating strangers and the poor and the destitute with kindness when they arrive, of giving them food, of giving them respect, of treating them kindly. And when people do that, they're highly honoured in the book. And when they don't do that, if they respond to people with scorn or violence or hostility, they're deemed as unhonourable people. Not unhonourable. They're deemed as dishonourable people, vulgar people. And that's probably because at the time that the Odyssey was being composed, people really did rely on kindness and hospitality as they travelled around. I imagine fortunes were a lot less stable. Lots of people could end up on the brink of poverty very swiftly, and how you helped one another in those times of needs was probably really important to society as a whole. So just watch when you're reading the Odyssey of how that comes across, how strangers are treated and how important food and sharing and being at the table together is, because I still think that's an important thing for us to consider today, and I think it reveals such a lot about the culture of this story. The second cool thing to look out for in the Odyssey are long similes. It's just a real cool quirk of the writing style of the time. So we use similes and metaphors all the time. But they're normally quite short in our everyday language. You might say that somebody is as tough as old boots. We keep them short and snappy. But in the Odyssey, there are these long building similes, and when they turn up, it's really worth leaning into them and really trying to see the picture that is being created. But it's to get to the heart of an emotion that perhaps can't be expressed in simple words like happy or sad or angry. I'm going to read you an example of one. Try and picture this with me. So this is to describe a part where Odysseus has been stuck in a place for quite a long time and he's desperate to get back home. And it says this is in book 13. Like a lion grown weakly in a cage and pining for deer, his appetite denied, the taste of blood held back by his keepers, and he hungering for it, his wraths consuming in him as he roams up and down his cage, for he yearns to be free and sally into the field. So it was with the tears of Odysseus. I love it so much. The writing in the Odyssey is beautiful, and one way to keep an eye out for it is look out for the long similes and just enjoy them. Okay, and then the third thing to look out for is the characterization of women. There are some passages of this book that are hard to read from a modern feminist point of view. They might make you cringe, they might make you flinch, they might make you angry. There might be times where you're just thinking this is dismissive of the entire female sex. And some of it is. But I find some of the characterization of women and the discussions in there of their roles and their feelings and what's going on in their lives actually to be nuanced and interesting. So for where you have a character describing all women as conniving, false, unfeeling people, you'll also have the goddess Athena bravely going into battle on behalf of her chosen champion and moving the will of the gods. And then you've got Penelope using all of her wits and guile to try and keep the suitors from destroying her family. So I don't think the characterization of women in this book is simple or straightforward. But I do think it's probably reflecting on some of the circumstances of culture of the time it was written in. Okay, the final part of this video is I just want to give you some recommendations. If you read the Odyssey and you love it, you might also like these things too. So first of all, you might like to read the Iliad, which is Homer's other epic poem. The Iliad is set in the Trojan War and follows the battles pretty much of the last year. But it is a weird, I read it, there's lots of good stuff to enjoy. It's not my favourite epic poem, and it's not my favourite classic of this era or this kind, because although it's set in the Trojan War, it doesn't cover the beginning of the Trojan War, and it doesn't cover the end of it either. It ends before the horse idea is even thought up of. So don't read it like I read it. When I read the Iliad, I thought I was going to read about the Trojan horse, and the Trojan horse is not in the Iliad. And I was very disappointed when I read the Iliad because there's no horse, and nobody ever told me that the horse isn't in the Iliad. So if you read it and you know the horse isn't in there, you're probably going to be fine. Just know that the horse isn't in the Iliad, that's all I'm going to say. But if you like the Odyssey, you might like the Iliad, as long as your expectations are, you know, managed. But actually what I really recommend is that if you read the Odyssey and you love it, instead of reading the Iliad, I'd actually recommend Virgil's The Aeneid. So this is now a Roman text, and Virgil's a Roman writer. And the Aeneid is also set straight after the Trojan War, but it follows a young Trojan nobleman or prince, Aeneas, and he sets off on a journey with a bunch of refugees from Troy, and they make their way across the world and end up in the place that will one day become Rome. and it's kind of setting the Romans up to be the descendants of Troy and linking the Roman civilization to the Greek civilization. And that's also another fantastic epic adventure with monsters and princes and gods and goddesses, and it's a beautiful piece of work. So if you like the Odyssey and you want more of that, I recommend the Aeneid. Obviously, if you're on BookTube, you'll know that there's lots of Greek mythology retellings around right now, so I'm not going to list all of those because you already know of them. But I do recommend, as a starting place of, if you want to learn some more about Greek mythology and get it in a great storytelling fashion rather than like textbook, can I recommend Tales of the Greek Heroes by Roger Lancelin Green. This was a writer who was a contemporary of C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. His retellings of stories, he also did King Arthur and the Knights of Camelot. His storytelling is just fantastic. It's just a great collection of Greek stories told in a real readable fashion that still captures the adventure and fun of them. And I really enjoyed this edition. If you read the Odyssey and you fall in love with it, get a book of Tennyson's poetry and read his poem Ulysses. Ulysses is just the Roman word for Odysseus, and it will change your life. So yeah, if you like the Odyssey, read Tennyson's Ulysses poem, then memorise it and then speak it to yourself at the end of parties and holidays and cry. My final recommendation is, if you love the Odyssey, look up Epic the Musical on YouTube. There's a guy who has written a whole musical based on the Odyssey, and the songs are incredible. And I think it's inching closer and closer to having like a CD or a production made soon. I hope it is, because it's just fantastic. You might have also seen it flying around on TikTok quite a lot, Get in the Water, really popular. But once you know the story and then you listen to these songs, chills, it's amazing. Okay, so that's my introduction to the Odyssey. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't done so already, please do consider liking and subscribing. That way you can keep up to date with this series. I'll tell you that next time we do a Classics with Cathy video, I don't want to tell you what book it is yet, but I will tell you that the book was written in 500 BC. So we're skipping ahead 200 years in time. And it's another really special book and a surprisingly readable book. I'm already looking forward to telling you about it, but I should not tell you about it now. Instead, I should say goodbye. I hope you have a fantastic week. Next Friday, you'll have Rachel here, and she's going to be telling you about a new fantasy series that she's reading, which I already can't wait to hear about. So thanks very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye. So we use similes and metaphors in our language all the time. You might say tough as old boots, or I can't think of a single simile.